There's a special kind of shame that comes from watching someone suffer and doing nothing. In the frontier town of Bent Creek, that shame hangs heavy over every soul who turned away when Martha Hayes needed them most. 3 riders corner the elderly widow on her porch, mocking her dead husband and threatening to take everything she has left. The whole street watches through their windows, but nobody moves. Then a stranger steps forward, a quiet mountain man who doesn't know these bullies and doesn't care about their reputation. What he does next will leave the entire town speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Bent Creek wasn't always a town that looked the other way. There was a time not so long ago when neighbors helped neighbors and a man's word still meant something. The town sat in a valley where the creek bent around a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering secrets that went back 50 years. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where the general store extended credit based on a handshake, and where the church bell rang every Sunday morning without fail. Martha Hayes had lived in that little house on Elm Street for 40 years. She'd arrived as a bride of 28, her hand tucked into the arm of Samuel Hayes, a cavalry officer with kind eyes and a straight back. Together they'd built a life in Bent Creek, raised no children of their own but loved half the town's kids as if they were. Samuel had hung his cavalry saber above the mantel the day they moved in, and there it stayed, polished and proud, a reminder of honor and duty. Now Martha was 68, her hair silver as moonlight, her hands weathered from decades of work. Samuel had been gone 5 years, taken by what folks called an accident at the lumber mill. But Martha knew better. She'd seen the bruises that didn't match the story, heard the whispers that stopped when she entered a room. The Brennan boys had killed her husband because he wouldn't sell them his land, and everyone in town knew it. They just didn't have the courage to say it out loud. The Brennan family had come to Bent Creek 15 years ago when the railroad pushed through. Harrison Brennan was a Civil War profiteer who'd made his fortune selling supplies to both sides, never caring which boys in blue or grey died as long as his pockets stayed full. He'd bought up land, muscled his way into the bank, and slowly squeezed the town until it couldn't breathe without his permission. His 3 sons were cut from the same cloth, though each wore it differently. Cole, the eldest at 32, had his father's cruel streak and the brains to make it hurt. He ran the land office now, where deeds had a way of changing hands under mysterious circumstances. Jack, 2 years younger, was the muscle, quick with his fists and quicker with his silver-handled whip, the kind of man who enjoyed making others flinch. And then there was Eli, just 21, still young enough that you could see the boy fighting against what his family was trying to make him become. The town had learned to live with fear the way you learn to live with a bad knee or a persistent cough. Shop owners paid protection money they called insurance. Farmers sold their land at prices that would make a man weep. The sheriff, Clayton Webb, wore his badge but kept his eyes down, knowing that Harrison Brennan had the territorial governor in his pocket and enough money to make any man disappear. Martha Hayes lived on a fixed pension and the vegetables from her garden. Her house needed paint, her roof needed patching, and some mornings her bones ached so fierce she could barely rise from bed. But she had her dignity and Samuel's memory, and she'd be damned if she'd let the Brennans take those too. Every morning she sat in her rocking chair on that porch, the one Samuel had built with his own hands, and she watched the town wake up. She'd nod to her neighbors, water her flowers, and hold her head high even when her heart was breaking. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the air carried the first hint of autumn. The cottonwoods were just beginning to turn, their leaves edged with gold. Martha had been up since dawn, as was her way, and she'd already swept the porch and deadheaded the roses that climbed the rail. She settled into her rocking chair with a cup of coffee, Samuel's wedding band on a chain around her neck, and watched the town come to life. Across the street, the general store was opening, Henry Peterson, who'd run that store for 30 years, avoided her eyes as he swept his doorstep. 2 doors down, the blacksmith's forge was already glowing. Daniel Morrison, a good man with shoulders like an ox, glanced her way and offered a small, sad nod before returning to his work. The whole street knew what was coming. They'd heard the Brennan boys talking in the saloon last night, making their plans loud enough for anyone to hear. That's when the stranger rode into town. He came from the mountain road on a sturdy roan horse, leading a pack mule loaded with furs and supplies. The man himself was somewhere north of 50, with a face weathered by wind and sun, a thick beard going grey, and eyes that took in everything without seeming to look at anything in particular. He wore buckskin and wool, practical clothes for a man who lived rough, and he moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion could mean the difference between living and dying. His name was Caleb Stone, though nobody in Bent Creek knew that yet. He'd come down from his cabin high in the mountains to trade his furs and resupply before winter settled in for good. He did this twice a year, spoke to as few people as necessary, and disappeared back into the wilderness where he belonged. He'd been coming to Bent Creek for 7 years now, and most folks barely remembered his face from one visit to the next. Caleb tied his horse outside the general store and began unloading his furs. Henry Peterson emerged, nervous as always, and they conducted their business with few words. Caleb had a way of listening to silence, of hearing what people didn't say. He heard it now in the way Henry's hands trembled slightly, in the way the blacksmith's hammer strikes were just a bit too forceful, in the way the whole street seemed to be holding its breath. He loaded his supplies onto the mule flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, a few other necessities, and was preparing to leave when he heard the horses. 3 riders coming down Elm Street at a trot, not hurrying but not dawdling either, moving with the confidence of men who owned everything they surveyed. Caleb stepped back into the shadow of the store's overhang, not hiding exactly, just observing. The riders pulled up in front of Martha Hayes's house, and even from across the street, Caleb could see the old woman's back stiffen in her rocking chair. She didn't rise, didn't run, just set her coffee cup down on the little table beside her and folded her hands in her lap. Cole Brennan dismounted first, his boots hitting the dirt with authority. Jack followed, that silver-handled whip coiled at his belt. Young Eli stayed on his horse, but Caleb noticed his hands were loose on the reins, his shoulders tense in a way that suggested discomfort rather than anticipation. "Mrs. Hayes," Cole said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Martha said nothing. "My father sent us to discuss a business matter," Cole continued, climbing the 2 steps to her porch without invitation. "That piece of land you're sitting on, it's prime property. Creek access, good soil, perfect spot for the freight depot we're planning. He's prepared to make you a generous offer." "I'm not selling," Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear Caleb could see in the set of her jaw. Jack Brennan laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "That's what your husband said too, wasn't it? Right before his accident at the mill." The street went even quieter. Shop doors that had been cracked open closed softly, curtains that had been parted fell shut. Caleb Stone stood in the shadow of the general store overhang and watched an entire town turn its back on an old woman who needed help. And something in his chest, something he'd thought had died years ago in a different town under different circumstances, began to stir. Martha's hand moved to the chain around her neck, clutching Samuel's wedding band. Her lips trembled, but her voice didn't. "Get off my porch." Cole Brennan smiled. "Now, Mrs. Hayes, there's no need to be unpleasant about this." He reached out and knocked her coffee cup off the table. It shattered on the porch boards, the brown liquid spreading like blood between the cracks. That's when Caleb Stone set down his supplies and started walking across the street. Caleb's boots made no sound on the dirt street. Years of moving through mountain forests, where a snapped twig could mean the difference between eating and starving, had taught him how to walk quietly. The Brennan boys didn't notice him until he was halfway across, And even then, it was young Eli who saw him first, his eyes widening slightly. Cole Brennan was still talking, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "You see, Mrs. Hayes, my father's being more than fair. He could just wait until you can't pay your taxes, let the county auction off your property. But he's a generous man. He's willing to give you enough money to rent a nice room at the boarding house, live out your years in comfort. My husband built this house," Martha said, and now her voice did shake just a little. "We planted every tree, laid every stone in that walkway. I'll die before I let you take it." Jack Brennan stepped onto the porch beside his brother, his hand moving to the whip at his belt. "That can be arranged, old woman." Martha's hand tightened on Samuel's wedding band, her knuckles white. Tears began to slip down her weathered cheeks, but she didn't look away from them, didn't beg. Just sat there in the rocking chair her husband had made, crying silent tears while 3 men loomed over her and an entire town pretended not to see. "Gentlemen," Caleb said quietly, from the bottom of the porch steps. All 3 Brennan boys turned. Cole's eyes narrowed. Jack's hand stayed on his whip. Eli's shoulders relaxed just a fraction, as if he was relieved by the interruption. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Cole said. "Just a private business discussion." Caleb looked past them to Martha, saw the tears, saw the way her hands trembled even as she tried to hold herself together. He saw Samuel Hayes's cavalry saber hanging on the wall through the open door behind her, saw a life of dignity being ground under someone's boot heel, and he felt that old familiar weight settling onto his shoulders. The weight he'd carried for so many years before he fled to the mountains. The weight of choosing to care. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Martha directly. "Are these men bothering you?" Martha opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked at this stranger, this mountain man she'd barely noticed in his twice-yearly visits to town, and something in his eyes, something steady and unafraid, made her tears flow harder. "She's fine," Jack Brennan said, stepping down off the porch. "Now, why don't you go about your business before you find yourself in a world of trouble?" Caleb didn't move. He stood at the base of those porch steps, loose and easy, his hands at his sides. He wasn't a big man, not like Daniel the blacksmith, but there was something in the way he held himself that made Jack hesitate. "I'm going to ask one more time," Caleb said, his voice still quiet, still calm. "Ma'am, do you want these men to leave?" "Yes," Martha whispered. Then louder, finding her voice. "Yes, I want them gone." Cole Brennan laughed, but it was a forced sound. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Our father owns this town. The sheriff answers to him. The judge takes his money. You're just some mountain hermit who—" "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Caleb interrupted, and now there was steel in his voice. "I'm dealing with 3 men who think they can terrorize an old woman in broad daylight because nobody has the backbone to stop them." The street was absolutely silent now. In windows and doorways, faces appeared. The blacksmith stood in the entrance to his forge, hammer in hand. Henry Peterson peered around his store's doorframe. Even Sheriff Webb had emerged from his office down the street, though he made no move to come closer. Jack Brennan's patience snapped. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." He lunged down the steps, his whip unfurling with a crack that echoed between the buildings. It was a weapon he'd used 100 times, on horses and men both, and he knew how to make it sing. The silver handle flashed in the morning sun as the braided leather shot toward Caleb's face. Caleb moved. It wasn't flashy, wasn't the kind of move a young man trying to impress someone might make. It was simple, efficient, the result of decades of experience in places where mistakes meant death. He stepped inside the whip's arc, closer to Jack rather than away, and his hand caught the leather before it could complete its strike. He pulled, hard, using Jack's own momentum against him. Jack Brennan stumbled forward, off balance, and Caleb's other hand caught him by the collar. In one smooth motion, he redirected Jack's momentum, sending him sprawling into the dirt at the base of the porch steps. The whip fell from Jack's grip, and Caleb kicked it away, sending it skittering across the street. The whole thing took perhaps 3 seconds. Cole Brennan's hand dropped to the pistol at his hip. "You're a dead man." "Am I?" Caleb said, and now everyone could hear the change in his voice. It was still quiet, still controlled, but underneath was something that made Cole's hand freeze halfway to his gun. "Go ahead and draw, but you'd better be sure you're faster than a man who's spent 30 years surviving in places where everything wants to kill him." Cole's hand trembled. He wasn't used to fear. He'd spent his whole life on the other side of it, and the unfamiliar feeling made him angry. But he wasn't stupid. Something in this stranger's eyes told him that drawing his gun would be the last thing he ever did. Young Eli spoke for the first time, his voice tight. "Cole, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Eli," Cole snapped. Then to Caleb, "You don't know what you've done. Our father will hear about this. He'll send 20 men. He'll burn this entire street to the ground if he has to. Then he'll burn it," Caleb said simply. "But right now, today, you 3 are going to get on your horses and leave this woman alone." Jack had picked himself up from the dirt, his face red with humiliation and rage. "You think this is over? You think—" "I think if you're still on this porch in 10 seconds, I'm going to make sure you regret it," Caleb said. 1. Cole backed down a step. 2. Jack's hand moved toward his gun, but Eli grabbed his arm. "Jack, don't." 3. Cole Brennan pointed at Caleb, his finger shaking with fury. "My father is Harrison Brennan. He owns everything from here to the territorial line. When he hears about this, and he will hear, you'll wish you'd never been born." 4. The 3 brothers retreated to their horses. Jack had to be helped into his saddle, still dizzy from his fall. Cole mounted with as much dignity as he could salvage. Eli was the last, and before he turned his horse, he looked at Caleb with something that might have been gratitude or might have been warning. "This isn't over," Cole said, gathering his reins. "We'll be back, tomorrow, with our father and every man he can muster. And that old woman's house will burn, and you along with it." "I'll be here," Caleb said. The brothers rode off at a gallop, dust rising behind them. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, and slowly, very slowly, the town began to breathe again. Caleb turned to Martha, who sat in her rocking chair with both hands over her mouth. Tears streaming freely now, tears of fear and relief, and something she hadn't felt in 5 years. "Hope." "Ma'am," Caleb said gently, "are you all right?" Martha couldn't speak. She just nodded, her hands still clutching Samuel's wedding band through her dress. From across the street, Henry Peterson took a step out of his store. Then Daniel the blacksmith walked into the street, still holding his hammer. One by one, other townspeople emerged, not coming close, not quite ready to commit, but no longer hiding either. Sheriff Webb approached slowly, his badge catching the light. He stopped a few feet from Caleb, his face troubled. "Stranger, you'd better get on your horse and ride as far from here as you can. When Harrison Brennan hears about this—" "I heard the first time," Caleb said. "I'm not leaving." "Then you're a fool," the sheriff said. But there was something in his voice that wasn't quite condemnation, something that might have been envy for a man who still had the courage to stand up. Caleb looked at Martha Hayes, at this woman who reminded him of why he'd once worn a badge himself, in another life, in another territory. He thought about riding back to his mountain cabin, back to the solitude he'd chosen, back to a life where other people's problems weren't his concern. But he'd already made his choice the moment he'd set down his supplies and walked across that street. "Ma'am," he said to Martha, "would it be all right if I stayed nearby for a day or 2? Just to make sure there's no more trouble?" Martha finally found her voice. "You can stay here. I have a spare room. It's not much, but—" "That would be fine," Caleb said. "Thank you." He retrieved his supplies from across the street, aware of eyes watching him from every window. He led his horse and mule around to Martha's small stable, settled them with water and feed, and returned to the porch where she still sat, trying to compose herself. I don't even know your name, Martha said. Caleb Stone, ma'am. I'm Martha Hayes. She extended her hand and he shook it gently. My husband was Samuel Hayes. He was a cavalry officer, Caleb said, nodding toward the saber visible through the doorway. I can see that. He must have been a good man. The best, Martha whispered. He would have done what you just did. He did do it. Once. That's why they killed him. Caleb said nothing, just stood there on the porch Samuel Hayes had built, looking at the town that had let fear turn them into cowards. He thought about tomorrow, about Harrison Brennan and 20 armed men, about a fight he'd spent 15 years avoiding, and he realized he'd been running long enough. Mrs. Hayes, he said quietly, I think you'd better tell me everything. Dawn broke grey and cold, with clouds rolling in from the mountains. Caleb had spent the night in Samuel's rocking chair, dozing lightly between periods of full alertness. It was a skill he'd learned in the mountains, where predators moved at night, and sleeping too deep could mean never waking up. Martha emerged at first light, with coffee and biscuits. They ate in silence on the porch, watching the town wake up. This morning felt different. People moved with purpose, glancing toward Martha's house as they went about their business. Daniel Morrison was already at his forge, but the angle of his body suggested he was watching the road more than his work. The general store's door stood open earlier than usual, and Henry Peterson swept the same patch of boardwalk 3 times, his eyes constantly moving. The town bell, that old bronze bell that used to call people to meetings and celebrations, sat silent in its tower beside the church. It hadn't been rung in years, not since Harrison Brennan made it clear that unauthorized gatherings weren't welcome. But this morning, Sarah Mitchell stood near it, her hand resting on the rope as if testing its weight. They're thinking about it, Martha said softly. The whole town. You can feel it in the air. Caleb nodded. He'd felt it too, that electric tension that came before big moments, when everything balanced on a knife's edge and could fall either way. In his younger days, wearing a marshal's badge, he'd learned to read that tension, to sense whether a town would stand with the law or against it. Mrs. Hayes, he said, when the Brennans come, I need you inside the house, away from the windows. This is my fight, Mr. Stone. It is, he agreed. But it's also your testimony that matters most. You're the one who's been collecting evidence, building the case. If something happens to me, you're the one who can see this through. Martha started to protest, but something in his eyes stopped her. She'd seen that look before, in Samuel's eyes, the night before he went to the lumber mill, the look of a man who'd already made his peace with whatever came next. You're not planning to survive this, are you? She asked quietly. I'm planning to do what's right, Caleb said. Survival is secondary. Before Martha could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the street. Not 3 horses this time, at least 20, maybe more, coming at a steady trot that spoke of discipline and purpose. Caleb stood, checked his rifle, and stepped down into the street. The riders came around the bend, led by a man in his 60s with iron-grey hair and a face that had never known kindness. Harrison Brennan sat his horse like a general, reviewing conquered territory. His sons rode beside him, Cole looking vindictive, Jack eager for violence. Young Eli staring straight ahead with no expression at all. Behind them came men of various types, ranch hands loyal to the Brennan payroll, a few genuine outlaws who'd found protection under Harrison's wing, and even some townspeople who'd been pressured or paid to make a show of support. Caleb recognized 2 deputies among them, their badges catching the morning light. Sheriff Webb wasn't there, though. That was interesting. The riders stopped 50 feet from Martha's house, spreading out in a semicircle that was clearly meant to intimidate. Harrison Brennan dismounted with the stiffness of age and money, letting one of his men hold his reins while he walked forward. He moved like a man who'd never been told no in his life. I understand there was an unpleasant incident yesterday, Harrison said, his voice carrying clear and cold. My sons came to conduct legitimate business and were assaulted by a vagrant. That's a serious matter." Caleb said nothing, just stood in the street between Harrison and Martha's porch. "Do you know who I am?" Harrison asked. "I know what you are," Caleb replied. A ripple of tension went through the mounted men. No one spoke to Harrison Brennan like that, not in his own town. "I own this territory," Harrison said. "The bank, the land office, the telegraph, the freight company. I have contracts with the railroad and friends in the territorial legislature. When I want something, I get it. When someone crosses me, they regret it. Those are simple facts." "Here's another fact," Caleb said. "Yesterday, 3 men threatened an elderly woman on her own property. Today, you've brought an armed mob to do the same. In any territory that respects the law, that's a crime." Harrison smiled, but it was the smile of a wolf. "In this territory, I am the law. Now, I'm a reasonable man. I'm prepared to overlook yesterday's incident. If you apologize to my sons, mount your horse, and leave Bent Creek forever. You have 60 seconds to decide." "No." The single word hung in the air. Harrison's smile faded. "Then you're going to hang," he said simply. "Deputy Marsh, read the warrant." One of the men wearing a badge pulled out a paper and read in a monotone voice. It was a warrant for Caleb Stone's arrest on charges of assault and battery, resisting lawful authority, and threatening an officer of the territorial government. All lies, all signed by a judge that Harrison owned, all completely legal within the corrupt system he'd built. "You'll come with us now," Harrison said, "peacefully or otherwise. And Mrs. Hayes will sign over her property to settle the civil damages you've caused. Then this unpleasantness will be over." That's when the town bell rang. One clear, loud peal that echoed between the buildings and rolled across the valley. Sarah Mitchell had pulled the rope, and the sound was like a trumpet call, something awakening after years of silence. People began emerging from buildings. Not everyone, but enough. Daniel Morrison walked into the street, still carrying his hammer. Henry Peterson stood in his store doorway. James Chen came out of his restaurant with his teenage son beside him. Doc Hartwell appeared, black bag in hand, as if this were just another call. Thomas Morrison, Frank Cooper, and a dozen others, men and women, young and old, they all stepped into the street. Not between the armed riders and Caleb. They weren't ready for that yet. But they stood where they could be seen, where their presence meant something. They were witnessing, bearing testimony, refusing to hide. Harrison Brennan's face darkened. "What is this?" "This is people who are tired of being afraid," Sarah Mitchell called out from the church tower, still holding the bell rope. "This is a town that's finally remembering it has a spine." "You're all fools," Harrison said, his voice rising. "Do you think standing in the street will stop anything? I'll burn every business that defies me. I'll call in every loan, foreclose on every property. By next month, half of you will be homeless." "Maybe," Daniel Morrison said, his deep voice carrying, "but at least we'll be able to look our children in the eye again." More people emerged. Not everyone. Fear still held many, but enough to make Harrison Brennan reassess. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. When he showed force, people cowered. They always had before. Cole Brennan leaned down from his horse, speaking urgently in his father's ear. Harrison's hand went to the pistol at his hip, and for a moment the whole street held its breath. Then Sheriff Webb appeared, walking slowly down the center of the street. He stopped between Harrison's men and the townspeople, his hand on his own pistol, his face troubled but resolved. "Harrison," the sheriff said quietly, "this has gone far enough." "You're with them?" Harrison's voice was incredulous. "After everything I've done for you?" "You haven't done anything for me except turn me into something I'm ashamed of," Webb said. "I'm still the sheriff of this town, and I'm telling you and your men to stand down." "I have a warrant," Harrison said, waving the paper, "signed by Judge Morrison himself." "Judge Morrison, who owes you $50,000? Webb asked. "That warrant's not worth the paper it's written on," and everyone here knows it." Harrison's face went red with rage. "Then I'll dispense my own justice. Boys, take that man into custody. Anyone who interferes will be considered an accessory." The mounted men looked at each other. They were used to intimidating, frightened individuals, not facing down half a town. Several of them began to edge their horses backward. "Move!" Harrison shouted. "That's an order." Jack Brennan spurred his horse forward, drawing his pistol, but before he got 3 steps, Caleb's rifle was up and aimed. Not at Jack, at his horse's feet. The shot kicked up dirt directly in front of the animal, which reared and threw Jack into the street. "The next one won't miss," Caleb said calmly, working the lever to chamber another round. "Kill him!" Harrison screamed, losing all composure. "Kill them all!" But none of his men moved. They were looking at the townspeople, at Sheriff Webb with his hand on his gun, at Caleb, who'd just demonstrated he could shoot exactly where he wanted. They were calculating odds and finding them suddenly uncertain. Young Eli Brennan dismounted and walked toward his father. "Pa, stop. Just stop. Can't you see? You've already lost." Harrison backhanded his youngest son, sending him stumbling. "I've lost nothing. These people are mine. This town is mine." "No," Martha Hayes said from her porch, her voice clear and strong. "We never were. We forgot that for a while, but Mr. Stone helped us remember." She held up the wooden box of evidence. "I have documents, Mr. Brennan. Forged deeds, false contracts, testimony from people you've intimidated. My husband collected them before you killed him, and I've added to them every day since. The whole ugly truth of what you've done, written down where it can't be denied." "Give me those," Harrison snarled, starting toward the porch. Caleb stepped into his path. "No." They faced each other, the corrupt land baron and the mountain man who'd found his purpose again. Around them, the town watched and waited. The clouds overhead finally broke, and rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, washing the dust from the street. The rain fell harder, turning the street to mud. Harrison Brennan stood in it, his expensive clothes darkening with water, his face contorted with rage that had nowhere to go. His men were abandoning him, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of rats leaving a sinking ship. Horses backed away, riders exchanged glances, and one by one they found reasons to be elsewhere. "This isn't over," Harrison said, but his voice had lost its command. He was just an old man now, standing in the rain, watching his empire crack. "I'll bring federal charges. I'll have marshals here within the week." "Good," Caleb said. "I'll be here when they arrive." Harrison turned to his sons. Cole looked murderous, but calculating, already thinking about how to salvage the situation. Jack was picking himself up from the mud, his pride as wounded as his body. And Eli stood apart, rubbing his jaw where his father had struck him, something broken in his eyes that suggested it wasn't just his face that hurt. "Come on," Harrison said to them. "We're leaving." But before he could mount his horse, a voice called out from the crowd, "What about my farm?" It was an older man, thin and weathered, standing in the doorway of what had once been a hardware store. Caleb didn't know his name, but Martha did. "That's Robert Johnson," she whispered. "His barn burned, lost everything." "You said it was an accident, Mr. Brennan," Johnson continued, his voice shaking but determined. "But it wasn't, was it? Your men burned it because I wouldn't sell at your price." "That's slander," Harrison snapped. "I saw them," a woman's voice called out. "I saw Jack Brennan riding away from the Johnson place that night." More voices joined in. Stories that had been whispered in the dark were suddenly being spoken in daylight. The dam had broken, and everything Harrison had built on fear was washing away. "Enough!" Harrison roared. He drew his pistol, waving it at the crowd. "Enough of this! You think you can stand against me? I'll destroy every one of you." Sheriff Webb drew his own weapon. "Put it down, Harrison. You wouldn't dare." "I'm tired of what I've become," Webb said simply. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Harrison's gun moved from the sheriff to Caleb to the townspeople, as if he were trying to decide who deserved his bullet most. His face was purple with rage, his hands shaking. Then young Eli stepped forward and gently took the gun from his father's hand. "It's over, Pa," he said quietly. "Let it be over." Harrison stared at his youngest son as if seeing a stranger. "You dare." "I dare," Eli said, "because I don't want to be you. I don't want to end up standing in the rain, hated by everyone, with nothing but money and enemies." He looked at Caleb. "He's right. You've lost." Harrison stumbled backward, caught himself, and looked around at the faces watching him. There was no pity in them, no fear anymore either, just the cold satisfaction of seeing a tyrant fall. "This town is finished," he said hoarsely. "Without my money, without my business, you'll all starve. Give it 6 months, and you'll be begging me to come back." "We'll take our chances," Daniel Morrison said. Harrison mounted his horse with difficulty, his age showing in ways it never had before. Cole and Jack mounted too, though Jack kept looking back at the crowd as if memorizing faces for future retribution. Eli stayed on the ground, still holding his father's pistol. "Eli!" Harrison barked. "Get on your horse, now." "No, Pa. I'm staying. I'm going to help make this right. You're no son of mine." "I know," Eli said, and there was both pain and relief in his voice. "I've known that for a long time." The Brennan riders left at a gallop, Harrison in the lead, splashing through puddles and disappearing around the bend toward their ranch. The sound of hoofbeats faded, and the town stood in the rain, uncertain what to do with this sudden, unexpected freedom. Sheriff Webb holstered his weapon and approached Caleb. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish. I'm still not sure which." "Maybe both," Caleb said. "He'll come back, you know, with more men, better planning. Men like Harrison Brennan don't surrender. I know, that's why we need to move fast." Caleb turned to the gathered townspeople. "We have evidence of his crimes, and now we have witnesses willing to testify. But we need to get this to someone who can act on it before Harrison has time to cover his tracks or buy more protection." "The territorial governor is 3 weeks away," Doc Hartwell said, "and Harrison owns him anyway." "Then we go over his head," Caleb said, "to the federal circuit judge in Denver. He's clean. I knew him years ago when—" He stopped, having almost said too much. "When I worked in law enforcement." Sarah Mitchell stepped forward from the crowd, rain dripping from her hair. "Mr. Stone, who are you really? You move like a lawman, think like a lawman. You're not just some mountain hermit." The question hung in the air. Caleb felt the weight of all those eyes on him, people who'd just risked everything based on the word of a stranger. They deserved the truth. "My name is Caleb Thornton," he said quietly. "I was a federal marshal 15 years ago. Some of you might have heard the name. The older people had." Caleb saw recognition in their faces, shock in their eyes. The ghost of Shiloh, the man who'd cleaned up 3 territories and brought justice to places that had forgotten what it meant. "I thought you were dead," Sheriff Webb whispered. "I wanted to be," Caleb admitted. "After my family was killed by men like Harrison Brennan, I couldn't wear the badge anymore. So I took a new name and disappeared into the mountains. I told myself I was done with other people's fights." He looked at Martha on her porch. "But some fights find you whether you want them or not. Why didn't you tell us?" Daniel asked. "Because Caleb Thornton is dead. I'm just Caleb Stone now, a man who lives in the mountains and wants to be left alone. But if we're going to beat Harrison Brennan, we need to do it legally, properly, through channels he can't corrupt. And for that, I need to be Caleb Thornton again, just for a little while." Henry Peterson pushed through the crowd. "If you're who you say you are, you can get word to the federal judge in Denver. You have the authority." "I did have the authority. I'm not sure it still stands after 15 years. "Only one way to find out," Sheriff Webb said. "I'll ride with you. Between the 2 of us, we can get Martha's evidence to Judge Harrison, the other Harrison, the one who actually believes in justice." That's a week's hard riding each way, Caleb said. 2 weeks minimum. Harrison Brennan could burn this town to the ground twice over in that time. Then we defend it, Daniel said. We've stood up once. We can do it again. Caleb looked at these people, shopkeepers and farmers, a doctor and a teacher, men and women who just rediscovered their courage. Could they hold against Harrison's revenge? Against hired guns and systematic destruction? We'll need to organize, he said. Set up watches, prepare defenses, keep everyone together. Harrison will try to pick you off one by one if you let him. I can help with that, Eli Brennan said. He still held his father's pistol, now looking at it as if unsure what to do with it. I know how he thinks, I know his tactics, and I know where he keeps his records, the real ones, the ones that show all his illegal dealings. The crowd murmured, uncertain whether to trust him. But Martha Hayes stepped down from her porch and walked through the mud to where the young man stood. Your father struck you for doing the right thing, she said. That takes a kind of courage that's rare. If you truly want to help, we'll accept it. Eli looked at her with gratitude that bordered on tears. I'm sorry. For everything. For what my family did to your husband, to this town. You're not responsible for your father's sins, Martha said gently. Only for your own choices. Today you chose right. The rain began to ease, and somewhere above the clouds the sun was trying to break through. Caleb felt it like a physical thing, the weight that had pressed on this town for 5 years starting to lift. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The hardest part still lay ahead. But for the first time, victory seemed possible. They gathered in the church that afternoon, the largest building in town, neutral ground where everyone felt safe. Nearly 70 people crowded into pews meant for 50, with more standing along the walls. It was more than Caleb had hoped for, less than he'd feared they needed. But it was a start. Eli Brennan stood at the front beside Caleb, and that alone was worth something. The boy and Caleb saw now that's what he was, just a boy despite his 21 years, looked terrified but determined. In his hands, he held a leather satchel he'd retrieved from the Brennan ranch before his father could destroy it. Before we plan our defense, Caleb said, we need to understand exactly what we're defending against. Eli has agreed to share what he knows. The young man stepped forward, his voice shaking at first but growing stronger. My father keeps 2 sets of books, the ones he shows people and the real ones. I've been copying pages for the past year, ever since I realized what he was doing was wrong. He pulled out papers from the satchel. This shows every bribe he's paid, every deed he's forged, every threat he's made. There are names, dates, amounts. It's all here. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was more than they'd hoped, for actual proof from inside the Brennan operation. There's something else, Eli continued, his hands tightening on the satchel. My father didn't just kill Samuel Hayes. There were others. 3 men in the past 5 years who stood up to him. They all died in accidents that weren't accidents. He pulled out a worn ledger and opened it to a specific page. This is my father's private journal. He doesn't record the murders directly, but he records the payments to the men who committed them. Jack Brennan was involved in 2. Cole in all 3. And there's a name that appears in every entry, a man named Silas Cade. Sheriff Webb went pale. Cade's in town, has been for the past week. I thought he was just another drifter, but he's a killer, Eli said. My father brings him in when the local men aren't ruthless enough. He's killed at least 8 people that I know of, probably more. And right now, he's at the Brennan Ranch, waiting for orders. The mood in the church shifted. Standing up to Harrison Brennan and his cowardly sons was one thing. Facing a professional killer was something else entirely. We need to leave, someone said from the back. Take our families and go before it's too late. And go where? Sarah Mitchell countered. How many towns have you been run out of before you stop running? She's right, Daniel Morrison said. Besides, Brennan won't let us leave. Not now. We've humiliated him in front of the whole town. He'll hunt us down one by one to make an example. Caleb held up his hand for quiet. Listen to me. I know you're afraid. You should be. But fear kept you quiet for 5 years, and all it got you was more oppression. Today you found your courage. Don't lose it now. Easy for you to say, someone called out. You're the ghost of Shiloh. You're a legend. We're just ordinary people. I wasn't born a legend, Caleb said quietly. I was just a man who kept choosing to stand when it would have been easier to walk away. That's all courage is, making the hard choice when everything in you wants to run. He moved to the center of the church, where everyone could see him. Here's the truth. Harrison Brennan has lost. He just doesn't know it yet. His power came from fear and secrecy. You've taken both away from him. Now he's just an old man with hired guns and dirty money. And men like that always fall eventually. But how many of us will he take down with him? Doc Hartwell asked. That depends on how smart we are, Caleb said. Sheriff Webb and I will leave for Denver at first light. We'll take Martha's evidence and Eli's documents to Judge Harrison. Even if the territorial governor is corrupt, the federal circuit judge isn't. He'll issue warrants, send real marshals, men who can't be bought. That's 2 weeks, Henry Peterson said. Maybe more if the weather turns. What do we do in the meantime? You defend yourselves. You stay together. You don't let Brennan isolate you or scare you back into submission. Caleb pointed to the young men in the crowd. Set up a watch rotation. Every night, men with rifles keeping an eye on the approaches to town. He won't risk a direct assault if he knows he'll be seen. What about during the day? Someone asked. During the day, you live your lives, publicly, visibly. The more witnesses to everything that happens, the safer you are. Brennan thrives in darkness. So stay in the light. They talked for another hour, working out details. Who would watch when, how they'd signal danger, where people could gather if they needed to defend themselves. It was the kind of planning Caleb had done 100 times as a marshal, but these weren't trained deputies. They were ordinary people, learning to be brave. As the meeting broke up, an older man approached Caleb. He had the bearing of someone who'd once worn a uniform, and his eyes were sharp despite his age. Marshal Thornton, he said quietly, or should I call you Stone? Stone is fine, Caleb said. And you are? Captain James Anderson, retired. I served under General Sherman during the war. After it ended, I settled here thinking I'd left fighting behind. He paused. I know who you are. I was at Shiloh. I saw what you did there, how you saved that regiment when everyone else had written them off as lost. Caleb felt old memories stirring, painful ones he'd spent years trying to bury. That was a long time ago, Captain. Some things don't change, Anderson said. You're still the same man who wouldn't leave soldiers behind. That's why you're here now, isn't it? You can't walk away from people who need help. Maybe, Caleb admitted. Or maybe I'm just tired of running. Anderson studied him for a long moment. I have 15 men, all veterans, all still capable. We drill once a month, just to keep in practice. If you need trained fighters, I need this town to be able to protect itself, Caleb said. But yes, having experienced men would help. Can you organize them? Already done. We meet tomorrow morning to plan proper defenses. Anderson offered his hand. It's an honor to serve under you again, sir. After Anderson left, Martha approached with Eli Brennan. The young man looked exhausted, carrying the weight of his family's crimes on his shoulders. Mr. Stone, Eli said, I need to ask you something. When this is over, when my father's in prison, what happens to me? That depends, Caleb said. Did you participate in any of the murders? Any of the violence? No, I swear it. I stood by and watched sometimes, and that's sin enough. But I never hurt anyone. Then you testify against your father and brothers. You help convict them, and after that, you spend the rest of your life being better than they were. It won't be enough, Eli said. Nothing I do will make up for what they did. No, Caleb agreed. But you do it anyway. That's what redemption is, spending your life trying to balance scales that will never be even. Martha put her hand on Eli's shoulder. My husband believed people could change, that no one was beyond saving. I'll honor his memory by believing that too. The young man's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. As night fell, Caleb walked the perimeter of the town with Sheriff Webb and Captain Anderson. They identified the vulnerable approaches, the places where Brennan's men might try to infiltrate. Anderson's veterans would take the key positions, with townspeople filling in the gaps. You know he'll try something tonight, Webb said. He can't let what happened this morning stand. His reputation depends on it. I know, Caleb said. That's why I'm not sleeping. Neither should you. They set the watches 2-hour rotations, with fresh eyes constantly scanning the darkness. Caleb took a position on the church roof, where he could see 3 of the 4 approaches to town. His rifle lay across his lap, and his mind was clear in the way it only got before violence. Around midnight, he saw them, shadows moving in the darkness, too coordinated to be animals. 6 men, maybe 8, approaching from the east, where the creek provided cover. They were heading toward Martha's house, planning to burn it while everyone slept. Caleb gave the signal 3 quick flashes of his lantern. Around the town, other watchers responded. Within minutes, armed men were moving into position, silent as ghosts themselves. The attackers never had a chance. They were expecting a sleeping town. Instead, they walked into a prepared defense. Warning shots rang out, bullets kicking up dirt around their feet. They broke and ran, disappearing back into the darkness. One man wasn't fast enough. Captain Anderson and 2 of his veterans caught him trying to escape across the creek. They dragged him back to town, dripping wet and terrified. In the lamplight of the sheriff's office, the captive was revealed as one of Harrison Brennan's ranch hands, a man named Pete Dalton, who'd been seen drinking with the Brennan boys in the saloon. Talk, Sheriff Webb said. What was the plan? Dalton looked around at the hard faces surrounding him and realized he had no friends here. Burn the Hayes house, kill Stone if we got the chance. Make it look like an accident, a lamp knocked over, oil spilled. Who gave the order? Cole Brennan. But we all knew it came from the old man. Who else was with you? Dalton gave up 6 names, all Brennan loyalists. Webb wrote them down carefully. What else is planned? Caleb asked quietly. I don't know. I swear, this was supposed to be quick and easy. Get in, start the fire, get out before anyone noticed. Silas Cade, Caleb said. Is he part of this? At the mention of the killer's name, Dalton went even paler. He's at the ranch, but he's not involved in the small stuff. Harrison's saving him for... He stopped, realizing he'd said too much. For what? Webb pressed. For you, Dalton said, looking at Caleb. When you leave for Denver, Cade's going to ambush you on the trail. Kill you and the sheriff both, make it look like bandits. The room went quiet. Caleb had expected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was different. When? He asked. I don't know. Soon. That's all I heard. They locked Dalton in a cell and gathered in the office. Captain Anderson, Sheriff Webb, Martha, Sarah Mitchell, Daniel Morrison, and Caleb himself, an unlikely council of war. If Cade's waiting to ambush you on the trail, Anderson said, you'll never make it to Denver. He's supposed to be the best there is. Supposed to be? Caleb said quietly. You know him? I know of him. We crossed paths once, years ago. He's good, patient, methodical. He'll find the perfect spot and wait for days if necessary. Then you can't go, Martha said. We'll find another way. There is no other way, Caleb said. Those documents need to reach Judge Harrison. It's the only way to end this legally. Legally doesn't matter if you're dead, Webb pointed out. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he smiled, not happily, but with the grim satisfaction of a plan forming. Then we don't give him what he expects, he said. We give him what he thinks he wants. The next morning, Caleb and Sheriff Webb made a show of preparing for their journey to Denver. They loaded supplies onto their horses in broad daylight, with half the town watching. They discussed their route loud enough for anyone to hear. They'd take the mountain pass, the fastest way but also the most dangerous. Perfect ambush country. You think Brennan has spies watching? Webb asked quietly as they worked. I'm counting on it, Caleb replied. What no one saw was the second set of preparations happening in Martha's root cellar. Captain Anderson and his veterans were equipping themselves for a very different mission. They'd be following Caleb and Webb at a distance, staying out of sight, ready to spring a counter-ambush if Silas Cade showed himself. You're using yourselves as bait, Martha said, worry etched in every line of her face. It's the only way to draw him out, Caleb explained. Cade won't strike at the ranch, too many witnesses. He'll wait until we're in the wilderness, where he can vanish afterward. That's when we'll have him. And if something goes wrong, then I hope the town can hold without me. They left at dawn, riding out with the morning mist still clinging to the valley. Behind them, Bent Creek looked peaceful, almost normal, if you didn't know that armed men watched from rooftops and that fear still lurked in corners. Ahead lay the mountain pass, a day's hard riding through country where a single rifle shot could echo for miles. Caleb knew this territory. He'd spent 15 years learning every trail, every canyon, every place where a man might hide or hunt. That knowledge might be the only thing that kept him alive. By midday, they'd reached the Narrows, a place where the trail squeezed between two rock walls, with boulders above providing perfect cover for a shooter. It was the kind of place that made Caleb's skin crawl, the kind of place where good men died without ever seeing what killed them. He'll be up there, Webb said, his hand resting on his rifle. Maybe, Caleb said, but I don't think so. Too obvious. Cade's smarter than that. He'll wait until we're relaxed, thinking we've made it through the danger. They rode through the Narrows at full alert, rifles ready, eyes scanning the high ground. Nothing. The pass opened up into a small valley, and they stopped to water the horses and let the tension ease. That's when Caleb felt it, the sensation of being watched by someone who knew how to watch without being seen. He didn't turn his head, didn't change his expression, but his body tensed in ways that Webb recognized. He's here, Webb whispered. About 300 yards northwest, Caleb murmured. In those rocks above the tree line. You see him? No, but I know how he thinks. It's where I'd be. They made camp as the sun started dropping toward the horizon, building a fire and setting up bedrolls in plain sight. They talked and laughed, playing the role of men who thought they were safe, but both wore their gun belts, and both kept their rifles within easy reach. As darkness fell, Captain Anderson and his men moved into position. They'd been tracking Caleb and Webb from a distance all day, staying just out of sight. Now they crept through the forest, surrounding the area where Caleb believed Cade was hidden. The trap was set. Now they just had to survive it. Caleb kept the fire burning bright, making himself an obvious target. Webb pretended to sleep but kept his eyes cracked open, watching. Hours passed. The moon rose, turning the valley silver. Then the fire exploded, not from a bullet, but from a bottle filled with oil and lit with a rag thrown from the darkness. It shattered in the flames and sent burning oil spraying across their camp. Caleb rolled away, his blanket on fire, while Webb scrambled for cover behind a rock. 2 more bottles followed, turning their camp into an inferno. In the chaos and smoke, Caleb heard the sound he'd been listening for, the mechanical action of a rifle being worked, too far away to be an immediate threat, but close enough to be deadly. He didn't shoot at the sound. That's what Cade would expect. Instead, he ran toward it, using the darkness and confusion as cover, moving like he had during the war when he'd been a scout behind enemy lines. Behind him, he heard shouting Anderson's men moving in, thinking the battle had begun, but Caleb knew better. The bottles were a distraction, a way to flush them out. Cade would be moving now, relocating to a secondary position where he could pick off the confused defenders. Caleb ran through the darkness with the certainty of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading terrain. He knew where the good firing positions were, knew where a smart man would go after his first position was compromised. He found Cade on a rock outcropping overlooking the chaos below. The killer was exactly where Caleb had predicted, setting up for his next shot. He was a lean man, all wire and tendon, with eyes that reflected moonlight like a predator's. "Don't," Caleb said quietly, his rifle aimed at Cade's back. Cade froze. Slowly, very slowly, he set down his rifle and raised his hands. "Thornton," he said, "I heard you were dead." "I was. For 15 years. Now I'm not. Harrison Brennan hired me to kill you, paying good money. Nothing personal." "It never is with men like you," Caleb said. "Stand up. Slow." Cade stood, his hands still raised. But something in his posture warned Caleb too relaxed, too confident for a man who'd been caught. "You're good," Cade said. "Better than I expected. But you made one mistake." "What's that?" "You came alone." The voice came from behind Caleb, and he knew without turning that he'd been outplayed. There were 2 killers, not one. Cade had brought a partner. "Drop the rifle," the voice said, "or I shoot you in the back and figure out the rest later." Caleb calculated angles, distances, chances. None of them good. He started to lower his rifle. That's when Eli Brennan shot the second killer. The young man had followed them from town without anyone knowing, driven by guilt and a desperate need to make amends. His shot wasn't perfect. It hit the killer in the shoulder instead of center mass, but it was enough. The man stumbled, his own shot going wild, and Caleb spun and put him down with a single bullet. Cade moved then, diving for his rifle. Caleb was faster. His rifle butt caught Cade in the temple, and the killer dropped like a stone. Anderson and his veterans arrived moments later, weapons ready, but the fight was over. They bound both killers. The one Eli had shot would live, and Cade was just unconscious and secured the camp. "That was foolish," Caleb told Eli. "You could have been killed." "I know," the young man said, his hands still shaking. "But I had to. My family started this. I had to help end it." Caleb wanted to be angry, but looking at this boy who'd turned against his own blood to do what was right, he couldn't manage it. "You saved my life. Thank you." They made it to Denver 4 days later, with 2 prisoners in tow and enough evidence to hang Harrison Brennan twice over. Judge Harrison was a man in his 70s, grey as winter, but with eyes that had seen it all and believed none of it until proven. He reviewed Martha's documents, Eli's records, and the testimony of Silas Cade, who'd turned on his employer the moment he realized he was going to hang anyway. "This is damning," the judge said. "Mr. Thornton, you understand what you're asking me to do? Harrison Brennan has friends in high places. Arresting him will cause political waves." "I understand, Your Honor, but the law is supposed to be blind to politics." "Supposed to be," the judge agreed, "rarely is." He set down the papers and looked at Caleb with sharp eyes. "I heard you were dead. The ghost of Shiloh, they called you. The man who brought law to lawless places. That was a long time ago. Not so long that I've forgotten. You cleaned up 3 territories, made them safe for decent people. Then you vanished. Why?" Caleb was silent for a moment. "I lost my family to men like Harrison Brennan. And now? Now I've met people worth fighting for again." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "I'll issue the warrants. Full federal authority. I'll send marshals within the week, good men, ones who can't be bought. But Mr. Thornton, you need to understand something. Men like Brennan don't go quietly. When he hears these warrants are coming, he'll fight. He'll burn that town to the ground if he thinks it'll save him." "I know," Caleb said. "That's why I need to get back before he hears. We need to be ready." The judge signed the papers with a flourish. "Then ride fast, Mr. Thornton, and may God help that town, because they're going to need it." They rode back harder than they'd come, pushing the horses to their limits. News travelled fast in the territories. Telegraph lines and loose tongues meant that Harrison Brennan would know about the warrants soon, maybe within days. They needed to beat that knowledge back to Bent Creek. Captain Anderson and his veterans rode with them now, no longer trying to stay hidden. They were a small army returning home, armed and determined. On the 5th day, as they crested the ridge overlooking Bent Creek Valley, they saw the smoke. The town was burning. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. 3 buildings on fire, smoke rising thick and black against the afternoon sky. Caleb didn't need to ask what had happened. Brennan had heard about the warrants, and he'd decided if he couldn't have the town, no one would. "Ride!" Caleb shouted, spurring his horse down the mountain. Behind him, Anderson's veterans followed, their faces grim. They were hours away still, and in those hours, everything could be lost. Sheriff Webb pulled alongside Caleb. "Think anyone's still alive?" "Martha is," Caleb said with certainty he didn't quite feel. "She survived 5 years of Brennan's harassment. She'll survive this." But even as he said it, he wondered. Martha was strong, but she was also 68 years old, and Harrison Brennan was a man with nothing left to lose. That made him the most dangerous kind of enemy. The sun was setting by the time they reached the valley floor. The smoke was thicker now, the fires spreading, and from somewhere in that smoke came the sound of gunfire, sporadic, desperate, the sound of people fighting for their lives. Caleb loaded his rifle as he rode, checked his pistol, and prepared himself for what came next. He'd lost one town to men like Harrison Brennan. He wouldn't lose another. Not while he still had breath in his body. The battle erupted on all sides. Captain Anderson's veterans opened fire from the east, their disciplined volleys forcing Brennan's men away from the windows. Daniel Morrison and the townspeople pressed from the south, using every scrap of cover as they advanced. And Caleb moved through the chaos like a ghost, exactly as he'd done at Shiloh all those years ago. He wasn't trying to kill, that was important to remember. These were desperate men, some of them just following orders. But he would stop them. He reached the mill's loading dock and slipped inside through a broken door. The interior was dark, except for lamplight, full of shadows and machinery that hadn't run in years. He could hear footsteps above him, men running to defensive positions, shouting orders and curses. A figure appeared on the stairs, Jack Brennan, still carrying that silver-handled whip, though he'd added a pistol to his belt. He saw Caleb, and his face twisted with recognition and hate. "You!" Jack snarled, drawing his gun. Caleb was faster. His shot hit Jack's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning away. Jack screamed and clutched his bleeding hand, and Caleb was on him before he could recover, using the butt of his rifle to knock the younger man unconscious. One down. Above him, he heard Harrison's voice. "Where is he? Find Thornton and kill him. I'll pay double to whoever brings me his head." Caleb climbed the stairs cautiously. The second floor was more open, a large space where grain had once been sorted and stored. Now it was full of frightened, angry men who'd bet everything on Harrison Brennan's promise of easy money and were realizing too late they'd chosen the wrong side. A hired gun stepped into the open, rifle raised, but he was young, maybe 19, and his hands shook. Caleb saw it in his eyes, the moment when survival became more important than pay. "Don't," Caleb said quietly. "You can walk out of here alive. North door's open. Take it." The young man looked toward the stairs where Harrison's voice still echoed, then back at Caleb. He made his choice, dropped his rifle, and ran. Others followed his example. The hired guns who'd come for money realized this was a fight that couldn't be won. One by one, they slipped out the north door, disappearing into the twilight. Some of Anderson's men let them go, understanding that these weren't the real enemy. That left the true believers, the ones who'd committed crimes with the Brennans and knew they'd hang if justice prevailed. Maybe 10 men, cornered and desperate. And the Brennans themselves. Caleb found Cole in what had been the mill owner's office. The eldest son was frantically burning papers, trying to destroy evidence. When he saw Caleb, he drew his gun. "You've destroyed everything," Cole said, his voice shaking with rage. "Decades of work, of building something, all gone because you couldn't mind your own business." "You built it on the backs of good people," Caleb replied. "It was always going to fall." Cole fired. Caleb had been expecting it, had been reading the tension in the younger man's shoulders. He moved as the trigger pulled, the bullet passing where he'd been standing. His return shot was precise, not lethal, but disabling. Cole dropped his gun and fell against the desk, clutching his shoulder. Two down. Harrison Brennan stood on the mill's third floor, surrounded by his last loyal men. He held a burning torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. Below him, Caleb could see barrels of lamp oil, enough to turn the whole mill into an inferno. "That's far enough, Thornton," Harrison said. His face was haggard, aged a decade in just days. The empire he'd built was crumbling, and he couldn't accept it. "I'll burn this whole place down, everyone in it. You, my sons, all of us. I'd rather die than be humiliated." "Then you'll die," Caleb said simply, "but I'm not letting you take anyone else with you." He raised his rifle, but Harrison moved the torch closer to the oil barrels. "One shot, and we all burn. Are you willing to risk that?" In the silence that followed, another voice spoke. "I'm not." Young Eli Brennan stepped out from behind a pile of sacks where he'd been hiding. He was dirty, exhausted, and his face was set with grim determination. In his hands, he held his father's pistol, the one he'd taken from him in the street days ago. "Eli," Harrison said, shock and betrayal mixing in his voice, "you're my son." "I was your son," Eli said, "but I won't be part of this anymore. I won't let you kill more people just to save your pride." "I gave you everything," Harrison said, and now his voice broke. "Everything I built was supposed to be yours, you and your brothers. I was making an empire for my sons." "You were making a prison," Eli replied, "and I'm done living in it." He raised the pistol, aiming it at his father. "Drop the torch, surrender, let it end." For a long moment, father and son stared at each other across the burning torch. Harrison's face cycled through emotions, rage, hurt, incomprehension. How had it come to this? How had his own blood turned against him? "You'll hang," Harrison said finally. "Without me, without my protection, you'll hang for what you know about, for what you've been party to." "Maybe," Eli said, "but at least I'll hang with a clear conscience. Can you say the same?" Harrison Brennan looked around at the mill that had become his last stand. He looked at his wounded sons below, at the men who'd abandoned him, at the town he'd terrorized, standing firm against him. He looked at Caleb Thornton, the ghost of Shiloh, the man who'd come back from the dead to destroy everything Harrison had built. And he dropped the torch. But not toward the floor, toward the oil barrels. Caleb dove forward, but he was too far away. Eli fired, hitting his father in the arm, making him stagger. The torch fell, spinning through the air, trailing sparks. It landed in a puddle of spilled oil. The fire spread instantly, racing along oil trails, climbing walls, consuming everything. Harrison's remaining men fled, screaming, abandoning their employer to save themselves. Caleb grabbed Harrison, who was clutching his bleeding arm, and dragged him toward the stairs. Eli helped his wounded brothers, Cole and Jack, both barely conscious, and together they descended through smoke and flame. The old mill was tinder dry, built in an era when fire safety wasn't a concern. It went up like a torch itself, flames reaching into the sky. They made it out just before the roof collapsed. Anderson's veterans pulled them to safety as the mill became an inferno, lighting up the night sky. Harrison Brennan lay on the ground, coughing, bleeding, watching his final fortress burn. Caleb stood over him, rifle ready, waiting for the last of the fight to drain away. "It's over," Caleb said quietly. "Finally over." Harrison looked up at him with eyes that were still full of hate, but also, finally, defeat. "I could have owned this entire territory. I was so close." "You owned nothing," Caleb said. You just rented fear for a while, but people always find their courage eventually. Sheriff Webb arrived with chains, officially placing Harrison and his sons under arrest. The federal warrants were read, the charges recited. The Brennan dynasty, built on cruelty and corruption, ended in fire and handcuffs on a cold September night. Around them, the town of Bent Creek watched their tormentor finally brought to justice. Some wept, some cheered. Most just stood in stunned silence, hardly believing it was real. 3 weeks had passed since the night the mill burned. Federal marshals had come and gone, taking Harrison and Cole Brennan to Denver to face trial. Jack had been transported separately after his hand healed enough to travel. The evidence was overwhelming: Martha's documents, Eli's testimony, the confessions of hired guns who saw cooperation as their only hope. The town was rebuilding. Where the general store had stood, a new foundation was being laid. Henry Peterson's son had taken over the business, determined to honor his father's memory. The hardware shop was already reopened, operated by the owner's widow with help from neighbors. And Martha's house, the one that had started it all, was being reconstructed by volunteers who worked every evening after their own jobs were done. Caleb stood on what would be Martha's new porch, watching the work. Daniel Morrison and his son Thomas were fitting boards, their hammers ringing in rhythm. Captain Anderson and his veterans had stayed on to help, finding purpose in building rather than fighting. Even young Eli Brennan was there, working harder than anyone, trying to atone for his family's sins, one nail at a time. "It's going to be beautiful," Martha said, joining him. She looked tired but content, more at peace than she'd been in 5 years. Bigger than the old house. Samuel would have liked that. He would have liked seeing the town stand together. Caleb said, "That's what this really is, not just a house, but a statement that you won't be intimidated, that Bent Creek belongs to its people again." Sarah Mitchell approached with a basket of food for the workers. She'd taken on an informal leadership role in the town, organizing the rebuilding efforts and making sure everyone's needs were met. Some were already talking about her running for mayor in the spring election, the first real election Bent Creek would have in years. "Mr. Stone," she said, using the name he preferred, "there's a town meeting tonight. We'd like you to be there." "What's it about?" "You," she said simply. "What happens next? We owe you everything, but we also understand you have your own life, your cabin in the mountains." Caleb had been thinking about this. His supplies were restocked. His horses were rested. Nothing was stopping him from riding back to the high country where he belonged, where he'd found peace after years of pain. Except he didn't feel the pull he used to. The solitude that had once been healing now felt like hiding. The meeting that night filled the rebuilt church. Every seat was taken, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. Sheriff Webb called it to order, but Sarah Mitchell spoke first. "Mr. Stone, Caleb, you came to our town as a stranger. You stayed when you could have left. You fought when you could have walked away. You gave us back our courage and our freedom. For that, we'll be forever grateful." People nodded and murmured agreement. "We know you're planning to leave," Sarah continued. "Return to your mountain home, and we understand that. But before you go, we wanted to make you an offer." She pulled out a piece of paper, official-looking, with the territorial seal. "This is a deed for land at the north end of town, near the creek. Good soil, water access, room for a house and outbuildings. It's not much compared to what you've given us, but—" "I can't accept that," Caleb said. "Please," Martha Hayes stood. "Let an old woman speak her piece. You gave me my home back. Let us give you one." "I have a home," Caleb said, "in the mountains." "You have a cabin," Martha corrected gently, "a place to hide from the world. But a home is more than walls and a roof. It's people who care about you. It's community. It's belonging to something bigger than yourself." Caleb was silent. He thought about his mountain cabin, solid, secure, lonely. He thought about the past 3 weeks, working alongside people to rebuild what had been destroyed. He thought about Daniel's jokes, Martha's coffee, Sarah's quiet strength. He thought about feeling useful again, feeling like his life had purpose. "I'm not the same man I was," he said finally. "Caleb Thornton died 15 years ago. I don't know if I can be what you need." "We don't need Caleb Thornton," Daniel Morrison said, standing. "We don't need a legend or a marshal or anyone except the man who stood on Martha's porch and said no when everyone else said nothing. We need Caleb Stone, the mountain man who remembered how to care." Others stood too, one by one, until the whole church was on its feet. "Stay," they said. "Please stay." Caleb looked at their faces, these ordinary people who'd found extraordinary courage. He thought about Samuel Hayes's cavalry saber, which Martha had insisted he keep. He thought about his father's pocket watch, measuring out moments he'd almost let slip away unused. He thought about second chances, about whether a man could come back from the dead and actually live again. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll stay." The church erupted in cheers and applause. Martha hugged him, tears streaming down her face. Others crowded around to shake his hand, to thank him, to welcome him home. Later, after the celebration had died down, Caleb walked through the quiet town with Sheriff Webb. The streets were peaceful now. The fear that had hung over everything finally lifted. "You made the right choice," Webb said. "These people need you." "Maybe," Caleb said, "or maybe I need them." They stopped in front of where the new town hall was being planned. A photograph had been hung temporarily on a post the town founders from 50 years ago. Samuel Hayes was there among them, young and proud, believing in the future. "You know what Samuel told me once," Webb said. "He said that a town is only as good as the people willing to stand for it. For 5 years, we forgot that. But you reminded us." "Samuel reminded you," Caleb corrected. "Through Martha, through that saber hanging on her wall, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "That's called providence," Webb said, "or fate, or maybe just luck. Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it." Caleb touched the pocket watch through his vest. Tomorrow he'd start building his house. He'd use the plans he and Martha had sketched out, something simple but solid, with a porch facing the mountains so he'd never forget where he'd come from. And he'd live here, in this town that had found its courage, surrounded by people who understood that standing together was the only way to stand at all. As he walked back toward Martha's temporary shelter, she was staying with Sarah until her house was finished. He saw the new rocking chair they'd presented to her. It sat on Sarah's porch, empty now but ready. Tomorrow Martha would sit there and neighbors would wave. Children would play nearby. The town bell would ring for celebrations instead of warnings. Some men are meant to stand alone, Caleb had once believed. But maybe, just maybe, some men are meant to stand alone until they find people worth standing with. People who remind them that isolation isn't strength, it's just fear wearing a different mask. He thought about his wife and daughter, gone so many years now. He thought about the guilt he'd carried, the belief that he could have saved them if he'd been there. But standing in the ruins of his old life, he finally understood something Martha had tried to tell him. You honor the dead by living well, not by dying slowly in the mountains. The next morning, Caleb Stone began building his house. Around him, Bent Creek continued its own rebuilding, board by board, brick by brick, creating something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. It wasn't the same town it had been before the Brennans came. It was stronger, better. A place where people had learned that courage was contagious, that standing together mattered, and that sometimes the stranger who rides in from the mountains is exactly who you need to remember who you really are. And on Martha Hayes's new porch, when it was finally finished, hung Samuel's cavalry saber, polished, proud, and no longer just a memory of honor, but a living symbol that honor still existed in a world that sometimes forgot.